The celebration had been perfect until the alarm started screaming. Emperor Valthos VIII stood on the observation deck of his orbital palace, watching the greatest display of power the galaxy had ever witnessed. Below him, arranged in perfect formation, floated 12,000 warships. They had come from every corner of the Valorian Empire to honor the anniversary of his ascension. Battle cruisers the size of cities, carriers that held enough fighters to darken a planet's sky, dreadnoughts whose weapons could crack continents. This was the might of an empire that had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years. No species had ever challenged Valorian supremacy and survived. The graveyard of history was filled with those who had tried. "A magnificent sight, Your Radiance," said Grand Admiral Thesic, standing 3 steps behind the Emperor as protocol demanded. His 4 eyes reflected the lights of the assembled fleet. "Never in our history have so many vessels gathered in one place." The Emperor smiled. He was old for his species, nearly 400 years, but rejuvenation treatments kept him looking like a male in his prime. Golden scales covered his body, marking him as pure imperial bloodline. "Let the galaxy see this and remember," he said. "Let them remember why the Valorian Empire has no equals." That was when the first alarm sounded. Thesic's communicator erupted with urgent voices. The Admiral's face went pale, his scales shifting from confident blue to worried gray. "Your Radiance long-range sensors have detected an anomaly at the edge of the system." "An anomaly?" The Emperor turned, annoyed at the interruption. "Be specific." "A ship, Your Radiance. A single ship just dropped out of hyperspace." The Emperor laughed. "A single ship? During our celebration? Some fool has wandered into the wrong system. Send a patrol to escort them away." "Your Radiance." Thesic's voice trembled in a way the Emperor had never heard before. "The ship, the sensors must be malfunctioning. They say it measures 400 kilometers in length." Silence fell over the observation deck. The Emperor stared at his admiral. "That's impossible. The largest vessel ever built was my grandfather's flagship, and it was only 12 kilometers long. Check your equipment." "We have checked, Your Radiance, 3 times. The readings are accurate." Thesic swallowed hard. "It's heading toward us, slowly, as if it wants us to see it coming." The Emperor walked to the sensor display that dominated one wall of the deck. His advisors parted before him like water before a blade. He stared at the screen, at the small dot moving through space, at the numbers beside it that made no sense. 423 kilometers long, 91 kilometers wide at its widest point. Mass readings that the sensors couldn't properly calculate because they exceeded the system's parameters. "Show me visual," the Emperor commanded. The screen flickered. Then it displayed the approaching vessel, magnified 1,000 times. The Emperor felt his heart stop. The ship was black. Not painted black, but somehow darker than the space around it, as if it swallowed light itself. Its hull was covered in angles and edges that hurt to look at, a design language that seemed almost aggressive in its brutality. No curves, no elegance, just pure, terrifying function. Compared to this thing, the Emperor's fleet looked like children's toys. "What is it?" someone whispered. No one answered. No one could answer. Nothing in galactic records matched this vessel. Nothing in known history suggested any species capable of building such a monster. Then the communication channel crackled. "This is the UNSV Prometheus," said a voice in perfect Imperial standard. It was a female voice, calm and steady, speaking the Empire's language without accent or error. "We request an audience with Emperor Valthos. Humanity has questions that require answers." The observation deck erupted in chaos. Advisors shouted over each other. Military commanders demanded information. The word humanity echoed again and again, but it meant nothing to most of them. Humans? The primitives? The newcomers who had barely left their home system when the Empire first contacted them 2 centuries ago? Grand Admiral Thesic pulled up the file on humanity. It was embarrassingly thin. First contact, 213 years ago. Homeworld, a small rocky planet called Earth. Technology level, moderate. Threat assessment, minimal. Military strength, negligible. The file hadn't been updated in over 60 years. It was marked no strategic concern. "This is a mistake," the Emperor said, finding his voice. "Some kind of trick. The humans couldn't build something like that. They couldn't build anything like that." But the Prometheus kept coming, and with every passing moment, it grew larger on the screens. The fleet, that mighty fleet that had seemed so impressive moments ago, began to look very small indeed. In the communications center of the Imperial Intelligence Headquarters, a young officer named Velith watched the same sensor data with growing horror. She was a junior analyst, barely 50 years old, assigned to the thankless task of monitoring primitive species that posed no threat to the Empire. Humans had been one of her assignments. She had always thought something was wrong with the human file, the gaps in information, the lack of updates, the way every inquiry she made was quietly redirected or ignored. But she had been too junior to push the matter, too afraid of stepping outside her role. Now she understood. Someone had made a catastrophic mistake. Or worse, someone had deliberately looked away from something they should have seen. She pulled up the original contact reports from 2 centuries ago. The humans had seemed so harmless then, friendly, cooperative, eager to trade and share ideas. Their ships were small, their weapons modest, their ambitions apparently limited to a few nearby star systems. But Velith noticed something in the old reports that made her blood run cold. The human diplomats had been described as remarkably calm and unusually patient. One observer had written that they seemed like people who knew something others did not. What had they known? What had they been hiding? Back in the throne room, the Emperor's shock was transforming into anger. He was Valthos VIII, ruler of 1,000 worlds, commander of the greatest military force in galactic history. He would not be intimidated by a single ship, no matter how large. "Deny their request," he commanded. "We do not grant audiences on demand like common merchants. If they want to speak with the Empire, they can submit a formal diplomatic petition through proper channels." His advisors exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared object. "Furthermore," the Emperor continued, his confidence returning, "order the 3rd Dreadnought Squadron to intercept that vessel. Fire a warning shot across their bow. Let these humans know they cannot simply appear in our sovereign space and make demands." Grand Admiral Thesic hesitated. "Your Radiance, perhaps we should first determine their capabilities." "I gave an order, Admiral." Thesic bowed and transmitted the commands. Across the void, 12 of the Empire's mightiest warships broke formation and accelerated toward the approaching giant. Each dreadnought carried enough firepower to sterilize a continent. Together, they represented the cutting edge of Valorian military technology. Velith watched on her monitors as the dreadnoughts closed the distance. She ran calculations in her head, comparing the energy signatures of the Imperial ships to the readings coming from the Prometheus. The numbers made no sense. The human vessel was radiating more power from its navigation lights than the entire dreadnought squadron was producing from its main reactors. The lead dreadnought reached optimal range. Its captain, a decorated veteran of 3 wars, opened fire. A beam of concentrated plasma shot across the void, brilliant enough to blind unshielded eyes, powerful enough to cut through any known armor. The beam struck the Prometheus directly on its forward hull. Nothing happened. No explosion, no damage, no reaction at all. The black hole simply absorbed the attack as if it had never occurred. The ship didn't change course. It didn't accelerate. It didn't return fire. It just kept coming, steady and unstoppable. The dreadnought fired again, then again. The other ships joined in, pouring their combined firepower at the approaching monster. Plasma beams, nuclear missiles, kinetic rounds accelerated to near-light speed. Everything the Empire's finest warships could throw. None of it mattered. The Prometheus ignored the attack completely. Its hull showed not a single mark, not a single scratch. Then almost casually, the human vessel responded. A single beam of light shot from somewhere on its bow. It missed the dreadnoughts entirely, passing between them without touching any ship. Instead, it struck a small moon that orbited at the edge of the system. A barren rock, uninhabited, perhaps 1,000 kilometers in diameter. The moon cracked in half. There was no other word for it. The beam hit, and the moon simply broke apart like an egg struck by a hammer. 2 massive pieces tumbled away from each other, trailing debris and dust. an object that had existed for billions of years, destroyed in an instant. The message was clear. The humans had not missed. They had chosen to miss, and they had demonstrated exactly what would happen if they chose otherwise. On the observation deck, the Emperor watched the destruction of the moon in complete silence. Around him, his advisors had stopped pretending to be calm. Some were praying, others were openly weeping. Grand Admiral Thesic had gone so pale that his scales looked almost white. The Emperor's hands trembled as he gripped the railing. In all his centuries of life, in all the history of his empire, nothing like this had ever happened. The Valorian Empire had always been the greatest power in the galaxy. They had always been the ones who demonstrated their might to terrified lesser species. Now they were the ones who were terrified. And somewhere in intelligence headquarters, Commander Velith began digging through every scrap of data she could find on humanity, because she understood now that the humans hadn't appeared from nowhere. They had been preparing for this moment, preparing for decades, perhaps for centuries, and the Empire had been too arrogant to notice. Commander Velith had not slept in 30 hours. The intelligence headquarters was in chaos. Officers ran through corridors, shouting contradictory orders. Senior commanders demanded answers that no one could provide. And through it all, the Prometheus sat motionless at the edge of the system, waiting with a patience that felt somehow more threatening than any attack. Velith ignored the panic around her. She had locked herself in an archive room, surrounded by data tablets and old records that hadn't been accessed in decades. Somewhere in this mess of forgotten information was the truth about humanity. She was determined to find it. The official file said humans were harmless. The official file was clearly wrong, so Velith went looking for the unofficial files, the classified reports, the buried secrets that someone had worked very hard to hide. What she found made her sick. It started with the original contact reports, the ones she had already reviewed. But now she dug deeper, finding supplementary notes that had been marked eyes only and then apparently forgotten. The first human diplomats had been studied extensively by imperial psychologists. Their conclusion was chilling. These beings show signs of extreme trauma, one report stated. They display behaviors consistent with species that have survived existential threats. Hypervigilance, careful control of information, deliberate presentation of weakness to avoid drawing attention. They are not naive newcomers to the galactic stage. They are survivors who have learned to hide. Velith kept reading. Another report, this one from Imperial Naval Intelligence, noted that human ship designs seem deliberately primitive. Analysis suggests these vessels are capable of significantly higher performance than demonstrated. Drive systems appear to be operating at reduced capacity. Weapon systems show evidence of concealed modifications. Recommend further investigation. The recommendation had been ignored. The file was marked low priority and buried. But the worst discovery came from a report filed by an Imperial trade delegation that had visited human space 70 years ago. The delegation had been shown human factories, human cities, human technology. Everything seemed modest and unthreatening. However, one delegate had gotten lost during a tour and wandered into a restricted area. What he saw there had disturbed him enough to file a secret report. Massive construction in deep space, the report read. Shipyards hidden in the void between stars. Scale of production far exceeds visible human civilization. When I asked about this, my guides changed the subject. They pretended not to understand my questions, but I saw fear in their eyes. Not fear of me, fear that I had seen too much. The report had been classified, then it had been buried, then apparently it had been deliberately erased from the main archive. Velith only found it because she knew how to access backup systems that most officers didn't even know existed. Someone in the imperial government had known the truth about humanity. Someone had chosen to hide it. Velith leaned back in her chair, trying to understand what she was seeing. The humans had been lying to the galaxy for 2 centuries. They had pretended to be weak while building something terrible in secret. But why? What had driven them to such extreme measures? She found the answer in the oldest files, the ones from before first contact. Humanity had not been alone in the universe. Before they met the Empire, they had encountered 3 other species. The records were fragmentary, but the pattern was clear. Each encounter had started peacefully. Each had ended in war, and in each case the war had been started by the other species attacking human colonies. The first attackers were called the Keth. They had seen humanity as prey, easy targets for their raiding fleets. They had bombed human worlds and taken human slaves. Humanity had responded with a fury that shocked even themselves. Within a decade, the Keth were extinct. Every ship destroyed, every world sterilized. The humans had erased them from the universe as thoroughly as if they had never existed. The second attackers were the Morvath, an empire that saw humanity as a threat to be eliminated before they could grow stronger. They had launched a surprise attack intended to cripple human civilization. The Morvath War lasted 30 years. It ended the same way: extinction, complete and total. The third attackers were the Thessari Collective, a machine intelligence that viewed organic life as raw material. They had attempted to harvest human colonies for biological components. The Thessari no longer existed anywhere in the galaxy. Velith stared at the screen, her hands trembling. 3 species, 3 wars, 3 extinctions. And this had all happened before humanity ever met the Valorian Empire. Now she understood why the humans had hidden their true strength. They had learned a terrible lesson from those early conflicts. The galaxy was not a peaceful place. It was filled with predators who preyed on the weak, and the only way to survive was to either become the strongest predator or to appear too insignificant to notice. Humanity had chosen to appear insignificant. They had smiled and traded and pretended to be harmless newcomers, all while building something in the darkness between stars, building ships like the Prometheus. But if that was their strategy, why reveal themselves now? Why come to the heart of the Valorian Empire with a ship that announced their true power to the galaxy? Something must have happened. Something must have forced their hand. Velith kept digging. In the Emperor's palace, the mood had shifted from terror to denial. Volthos had retreated to his private chambers, surrounded by his most trusted advisors. He refused to believe what he had seen. There had to be an explanation. There had to be a trick. Perhaps the ship is hollow, suggested one advisor. A bluff, a massive empty shell designed to frighten us. Then explain how they destroyed the moon, Grand Admiral Thessic replied flatly. His earlier fear had transformed into something cold and calculating. Unlike the Emperor, he was willing to face reality. Stolen technology, another advisor offered. Perhaps they found something, some ancient weapon from a dead civilization. They couldn't have built something like this themselves. Does it matter? Thessic asked. Whether they built it or found it, they possess it. They can use it. And they have made it very clear that they could use it against us. The Emperor paced the room. What do they want? They said they have questions. What questions could be worth this display? No one had an answer. Finally, the Emperor made a decision. He would grant the human request. He would speak to them, hear their questions, and find out what they wanted. Perhaps this could still be resolved through diplomacy. Perhaps the humans wanted territory, or trade concessions, or recognition of their new status. These were things the Empire could give. These were things that could be negotiated. The holographic communication system was prepared. The Emperor put on his ceremonial robes, the ones woven with precious metals and rare gems. He wanted to remind these humans that they were dealing with the ruler of 1,000 worlds, not some petty colonial administrator. When the connection was established, he found himself facing a human female. She was old by their species standards, her hair gray and her face lined with years, but her eyes were steady and she showed no sign of intimidation. I am Emperor Valthos VIII, the Emperor began, using his formal voice. Ruler of the Valorian Empire, Lord of 1,000 worlds, voice of the eternal throne. You have requested an audience. Speak your questions. I am Admiral Chen, the human replied. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. Commander of the United Nations space vessel Prometheus. I thank you for agreeing to speak with us, Your Radiance. The Emperor waited. The human seemed in no hurry. 40 years ago, Admiral Chen continued, a species called the Dreth attacked a human colony world. The planet was called New Harmony. It was a farming world, home to 80,000 civilians. The Dreth killed them all. Valthos felt a cold sensation in his chest. He had never heard of this attack, but he knew the Dreth. They were a client species, loyal to the Empire, used for tasks that required brutality without accountability. The attack was not random, the Admiral said. It was authorized by an Imperial regional governor named HFY War. He wanted to test human military capabilities. He wanted to see how we would respond to a provocation. Grand Admiral HFY went very still. HFY War was his father. We did not respond, Admiral Chen continued. Not then. We buried our dead. We comforted the survivors. And we pretended that we lacked the strength to seek justice. Your empire looked at us and saw exactly what it expected to see. A weak species. A species that could be attacked without consequence. She leaned forward slightly. Your empire was wrong. The Emperor found his voice. You cannot prove these accusations. You cannot. We can prove everything. The Admiral gestured and data began streaming through the holographic display. Orders bearing Imperial seals. Communications between the regional governor and the Dreth commanders. After-action reports celebrating the successful test. Evidence that had been gathered over 4 decades of patient investigation. The Dreth were rewarded for their service, Admiral Chen said. They received 3 new colony worlds. Your regional governor was promoted, and our dead were forgotten. By your empire, at least. We never forgot them. The Emperor stared at the evidence scrolling past. It was undeniable. It was catastrophic. If this became public, it would shake the foundations of the Empire. What do you want? He asked finally. Reparations? Territory? Name your price. Admiral Chen shook her head slowly. We do not want payment, Your Radiance. We want justice. The regional governor will be tried for war crimes. The Dreth leaders who planned and executed the attack will be tried for war crimes. The truth will be made public. The galaxy will know what happened to New Harmony. And if I refuse? The Admiral's expression did not change. Then we will demonstrate what we would have done 40 years ago if we had chosen revenge instead of restraint. The only reason your fleet still exists, Your Radiance, is because we decided that your sailors were not responsible for their leaders' crimes. We chose to believe that the Valorian people are better than their government. She paused. Do not make us reconsider that choice. The Emperor's face twisted with rage. He was not accustomed to being threatened. He was not accustomed to being given ultimatums. He was the Emperor. He did not negotiate with lesser species. This audience is over, he snarled. You will regret this arrogance, human. He terminated the connection. In intelligence headquarters, Velith watched the exchange in horror. She had found the files on New Harmony. She had seen the evidence of what had been done, and she understood with terrible clarity that the Emperor had just made the worst decision of his life. Her console flickered. A new message appeared, using a communication protocol she didn't recognize. The sender was identified simply as a friend. The message read, Commander Velith, we know you have been investigating. We know you understand the truth. The next few hours will decide whether your empire survives or falls. You can help ensure it survives. Respond if you wish to talk. Velith stared at the message. The humans had been watching her. They had been monitoring Imperial communications, reading their files, tracking their analysts. Of course they had. A species that could build ships like the Prometheus would have no trouble penetrating Imperial security. She thought about the 80,000 dead on New Harmony. She thought about the empire she had served her entire life. She thought about the choice that lay before her. Then she began typing her response. Emperor Valthos had made his decision. The humans would learn their place. He stood in the war room of his orbital palace, surrounded by holographic displays showing the positions of his fleet. 12,000 ships awaited his command, the greatest armada ever assembled in galactic history, against one human vessel. The odds seemed overwhelming. They were not. All fleet elements will engage the hostile vessel simultaneously, the Emperor commanded. Coordinate fire on a single point. No ship in existence can withstand that much concentrated firepower. We will crack this monster open and show the galaxy that the Valorian Empire cannot be threatened. Grand Admiral HFY stood at attention, his face carefully blank. He had argued against this course of action in private. He had shown the Emperor the energy readings from the Prometheus. He had explained in patient detail why attacking was suicide. The Emperor had not listened. The Emperor never listened. Your Radiance, Thesic tried one more time. I must advise caution. We have not yet determined the full capabilities of... Your advice is noted and rejected, Admiral. Execute my orders. Thesic bowed and turned to the communication console. Across the system, thousands of ship captains received their instructions. They would attack on the Emperor's signal. They would die on the Emperor's orders. Many of them understood this. They went to their stations anyway. Discipline was stronger than fear. Loyalty was deeper than survival. They were Valorian warriors. They did not question. They did not retreat. The Emperor raised his hand. On my command? The censor officer's voice cut through the moment. Your Radiance! New contacts! Multiple hyperspace signatures at the system edge. The holographic display flickered and updated. Where there had been one human ship, there were now 31. They emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, spreading across the void like a wall of darkness. Each one was as massive as the Prometheus. Each one radiated the same terrible power. The war room went silent. The Emperor's raised hand trembled. 31 ships, each capable of destroying moons, each apparently invulnerable to Valorian weapons. Together, they represented a force that could end the Empire in hours. Still want to give the order, Your Radiance? Thesic asked quietly. There was no mockery in his voice, only exhaustion. The Emperor lowered his hand. His face had gone gray. He suddenly looked every one of his 400 years. But he was still Emperor. He was still too proud to back down. This changes nothing, he said, though his voice shook. They cannot be willing to fight. This must be a bluff. Attack. Attack now. Thesic closed his eyes for a moment. Then he transmitted the order. 12,000 ships opened fire. The void between the fleets lit up like a sun being born. Plasma beams, nuclear missiles, kinetic rounds, energy weapons of every type known to Valorian science. The combined firepower could have sterilized a dozen worlds. It streaked across space toward the human fleet, and it never arrived. Commander Veleth watched from intelligence headquarters, her hand over her mouth as the impossible happened. The human ships activated some kind of defensive system that her instruments couldn't even properly read. It didn't block the attacks. It didn't reflect them. It simply made them stop existing. Plasma beams bent away from the human hulls, curving as if gripped by an invisible hand, then dissipating harmlessly into space. Missiles detonated while still kilometers from their targets, their warheads triggering prematurely as if the human ships could reach out and flip switches at a distance. Kinetic rounds, traveling at significant fractions of light speed, slowed and stopped, hanging motionless in the void before tumbling away. Nothing touched the human ships. Nothing even came close. The attack lasted for 3 minutes. The Imperial fleet emptied its weapons banks, reloaded, and fired again. And again. And again. It was like throwing pebbles at mountains. Then the humans responded, but they didn't respond with the moon-cracking weapon from before. Instead, thin beams of precise light began picking through the Imperial fleet. They struck engines, disabling ships without destroying them. They hit weapon systems, rendering them useless. They targeted reactors, forcing emergency shutdowns. They did everything possible to stop the Imperial ships without killing the crews inside them. Ship after ship went dark. Mighty dreadnoughts tumbled helpless through space, their crews alive but powerless. Carriers lost their launch capabilities. Destroyers and frigates drifted in silent clusters, their lights flickering as backup systems struggled to maintain life support. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less than an hour. When it was over, the greatest fleet in galactic history floated dead in space. Every ship disabled, every weapon silenced, but every crew member still breathing. The Emperor watched from his palace window, unable to speak. His empire had just been defeated. Not destroyed, but defeated. The humans had proven they could annihilate his fleet at any moment. They had chosen not to. That mercy felt more humiliating than a massacre would have been. On the bridge of the Prometheus, Admiral Chen watched the tactical display update with the status of the Imperial fleet. 97% of enemy vessels disabled. Estimated casualties, 0. Her weapons officer turned to her. Admiral, we could finish them. One command and the Valorian Empire ceases to exist. Chen shook her head slowly. We didn't come here to destroy them, Captain. We came here to give them a choice. She activated the communication system, broadcasting on all Imperial channels. Every surviving ship would hear this. Every station, every planet with a receiver, the entire Empire would know what she said next. This is Admiral Chen of the United Nations space vessel Prometheus, she began. Your fleet has been disabled. Your weapons are offline. Your ships are helpless. By any military standard, you have been defeated. She paused, letting the words sink in. 40 years ago, 80,000 of our people were murdered on New Harmony. We could have responded then. We could have brought ships like these and burned your worlds the way you burned ours. We chose not to. We chose patience. We chose to believe that justice could be achieved without genocide. In the war room, the Emperor stood frozen. His advisors had fled. Only Thesic remained, listening. Your sailors are alive because we decided they were not responsible for their leader's crimes. Chen continued. Your worlds are untouched because we believe the Valorian people are better than the government that rules them. We do not want conquest. We do not want revenge. We want justice. She outlined humanity's terms. The regional governor Thesic Vor would be surrendered for trial. The Dreth leaders who had ordered and executed the massacre would be surrendered for trial. The truth about New Harmony would be made public throughout the galaxy, and guarantees would be put in place to ensure that no species would ever be attacked as humanity had been attacked. You have 1 hour to respond, Chen concluded. If we do not receive confirmation of acceptance, we will demonstrate what we have spent 40 years holding back. We do not wish to do this. We are offering you a path that does not lead to more death. Please take it. The broadcast ended. The galaxy held its breath. In intelligence headquarters, Commander Veleth had been busy. The human contact had been legitimate. They had been monitoring Imperial communications for decades, and they knew exactly who had been trying to uncover the truth. They wanted her help, not to betray the Empire, to save it. The humans had given her access to their evidence files, the full documentation of the New Harmony massacre, the communications proving Imperial involvement, the cover-up that had kept it secret. Armed with this information, Veleth began reaching out to officers she trusted, flag officers who still had some capacity for independent thought. Commanders who had watched their ships get disabled and understood that the Empire's survival depended on making the right choice. The responses came slowly at first, then faster. A network began forming, not traitors, patriots, Valorians who could see that their emperor was about to destroy everything they loved through stubborn pride. Grand Admiral Thesic was the key. His father had ordered the massacre. His family's honor was stained beyond recovery. But Thesic himself had known nothing about New Harmony until today. He had served the Empire faithfully for 2 centuries, and now he had to decide what that service truly meant. Veleth sent him a message. Not a long one. Just the evidence and a single question. What kind of empire do you want to serve? In the war room, Thesic read the message on his personal communicator. He read the evidence. He saw his father's signature on orders that had killed 80,000 innocent beings for a test. The Emperor was ranting now, refusing to accept the terms, calling for reinforcements that could never arrive in time, insisting that the humans were bluffing despite all evidence to the contrary. He was going to refuse. He was going to doom them all. Thesic thought about his oath. He had sworn to serve the Empire, to protect it, to preserve it against all threats. Sometimes the greatest threat to an empire comes from within. Your radiance, he said quietly. The Emperor turned. What is it now? Thesic raised his sidearm. Around the room, other officers did the same. Men and women Thesic had contacted in the past hour. Loyalists who had realized that loyalty meant saving the Empire from its ruler. You are relieved of command, Thesic said, on charges of gross incompetence in the face of existential threat. The Council of Admirals will assume emergency authority until this crisis is resolved. The Emperor stared at him. You dare? I am your Emperor. You are a man who would rather see 1 trillion citizens die than admit he made a mistake, Thesic replied. I served you for 200 years. I would have died for you, but I will not let you kill us all. Guards entered the room. Not the Emperor's personal guards, but military police loyal to the fleet. They took the Emperor's arms and led him away, still screaming about treachery and tradition and vengeance. Thesic took a deep breath. Then he opened a channel to the human fleet. "Admiral Chen," he said, "this is Grand Admiral Thesic. The Emperor has been removed from power. The Council of Admirals has assumed emergency authority. We are prepared to accept your terms." There was a long pause. Then Chen's voice came back, and for the first time, Thesic heard something other than calm confidence. He heard relief. "Thank you, Admiral. You have no idea how much we hoped it would end this way." "I think I do," Thesic replied. "Now let us discuss how to move forward. Together." In her quarters on the Prometheus, after the communication ended, Admiral Chen allowed herself to weep. She had not expected the Valorians to choose wisely. She had prepared herself to give the order that would end their civilization. She had been ready to carry that burden for the rest of her life. Instead, they had chosen survival. They had chosen justice. They had proven that they were not the monsters who had killed her grandchildren on New Harmony. She wept for the 80,000 dead. She wept for the future that had almost been lost, and she wept with gratitude that she would not have to become the very thing she hated. Outside, the disabled Imperial fleet began receiving assistance from human rescue vessels. Humanity had prepared for this possibility too. They had hoped for it. They had brought ships loaded with repair equipment and medical supplies, ready to help their enemies recover from a defeat that could have been an extinction, because that was the choice humanity had made. That was who they had decided to be. The trial lasted 3 months. It was held on neutral ground, a space station constructed specifically for this purpose, in a system that belonged to neither humanity nor the Empire. Representatives from 47 species attended as observers. News drones broadcast every session to trillions of viewers across the galaxy. For the first time in history, a major power was being held accountable for crimes against a lesser species. Former regional governor HFY War sat in the defendant's box. His scales faded to a sickly gray. He had aged decades in the weeks since his arrest. Gone was the arrogant administrator who had ordered the deaths of 80,000 civilians as a test. In his place sat a broken old male who still could not understand why any of this was happening. "They were just humans," he said during one session, apparently unable to grasp why this mattered. "Primitive creatures. They should have been grateful for our attention." The prosecutor, a human woman named Diana Okonkwo, responded without emotion. 80,000 people, farmers, teachers, children. The youngest victim was 11 days old. Her name was Maya. She died in her mother's arms when your Dreth soldiers burned the hospital. The evidence was overwhelming. Communications, orders, after-action reports, recordings from Dreth soldiers who had documented their own atrocities as trophies. The cover-up had been so complete because those responsible had never imagined they would face consequences. Beside HFY War sat the Dreth commanders who had led the attack. They showed no remorse. They barely showed comprehension. In their culture, the strong preyed on the weak. This was a natural law. The fact that humanity had turned out to be strong rather than weak did not change the rightness of what they had done. It only meant they had made an error in assessment. Commander Veleth attended every session. She had been appointed as the Imperial liaison to the tribunal, a role that put her in an awkward position between her duty to the Empire and her growing understanding of what the Empire had allowed to happen. She watched the evidence presentations. She listened to survivor testimony from humans who had escaped New Harmony. She saw the faces of children who had lost parents, parents who had lost children, communities shattered by violence that had been authorized by her own government. By the end of the trial, she no longer felt conflicted. She felt ashamed. Grand Admiral Thesic felt the same. His father had been a monster, and the son had never known. Or perhaps he had known and chosen not to look. The uncertainty haunted him. Had there been signs he should have recognized? Had he been willfully blind? When he met with Admiral Chen several times during the trial period, these were not official diplomatic sessions. They were conversations between two military leaders trying to understand each other. "I keep asking myself what I would have done in your position," Thesic admitted during one late-night discussion. "If the Dreth had attacked one of our colonies, if 80,000 Valorians had been murdered, I think I think we would have responded with immediate overwhelming force. We would have destroyed them without hesitation. That was our first instinct, Chen replied. Believe me, we had hawks who wanted exactly that. People who said the only language the galaxy understood was violence. People who wanted to make an example so terrible that no one would ever threaten humanity again. Why didn't you listen to them? Chen was quiet for a moment. Because we had already done that. 3 times. 3 species that attacked us, and we erased them from existence. After the Thesari, we looked at ourselves and did not like what we saw. We had become exactly what we feared, monsters who killed without mercy. We won those wars, Admiral, but we lost something important in the process. So you chose differently this time. We chose to try something else, to believe that justice could work, that accountability could replace revenge, that we could be strong without being cruel. She smiled slightly. It's been the hardest thing we have ever done, holding back when we had the power to strike, preparing for 40 years while the people who murdered our families walked free, watching your empire celebrate while our dead lay unavenged. Thesek shook his head in wonder. I do not think my people could have shown such restraint. You might surprise yourself. Restraint is a choice. It gets easier with practice. The tribunal reached its verdict on the 93rd day. Thesek Vor was found guilty of authorizing mass murder. The Dreth commanders were found guilty of executing mass murder. The sentences were handed down. Life imprisonment in a facility that would be monitored by an independent commission. Not death. Humanity had been very specific about this. They did not want executions. They wanted the guilty to face justice, not martyrdom. They wanted them to live long lives behind walls, knowing that the galaxy remembered their crimes. The former Emperor Valthos had not been charged. This was controversial among humans who wanted him held accountable for the culture that had enabled the massacre. But Admiral Chen had argued successfully that removing him from power was punishment enough. He had lost his throne, his honor, his place in history. He would be remembered forever as the ruler who had been defeated by the species his empire had dismissed as primitives. Some fates were worse than prison. The galaxy watched the verdict and drew its own conclusions. For 12,000 years, the Valorian Empire had been untouchable. Lesser species had suffered at their hands without hope of redress. Now everything was different. Now there was proof that accountability was possible. On a dozen worlds, movements began forming. Species that had been oppressed by the Empire started demanding their own justice. Not with violence. They had seen what human restraint could achieve, but with documentation, with evidence, with appeals to the new tribunal structure that was being established. The humans had not just won a military victory, they had demonstrated an alternative to the endless cycle of violence and revenge that had defined galactic history. The Prometheus and its sister ships remained in Imperial space for several months after the trial. Not as conquerors, but as a visible reminder that humanity was watching. Human engineers helped repair the disabled Imperial fleet. Human diplomats worked with the new Imperial government to establish communication channels and trade agreements. Human observers monitored the reforms that Thesek's administration had promised to implement. It was an uneasy peace. Trust would take generations to build. Many Valorians still resented what had happened, still viewed the humans as upstarts who had humiliated their ancient empire. Many humans still harbored anger for New Harmony, still questioned whether their government had been right to show mercy. But the alternative was war, and everyone had seen what that war would look like. Commander Veleth became one of the key figures in the new relationship. Her role as liaison evolved into something more permanent. She worked closely with human diplomatic teams, helping them understand Valorian culture and politics. She translated not just languages, but worldviews, explaining why certain approaches would work and others would fail. One day, several months after the trial, she received a strange invitation. Admiral Chen wanted to meet with her privately, not in any official capacity. Just 2 women talking. They met on an observation deck overlooking a repair station where human and Valorian crews worked side by side on damaged ships. The work had become routine now. Former enemies had learned to cooperate out of necessity, and some of those working relationships were becoming genuine friendships. You asked me once why we contacted you during the crisis, Chen said. Why we reached out to you specifically. Veleth nodded. I assumed it was because I was already investigating New Harmony. You knew I was looking for the truth. That was part of it. But there was another reason. Chen paused. Before the Prometheus arrived, we spent years studying your empire. We identified people who might help if things went badly, people who had integrity, people who would choose what was right over what was easy. You were looking for potential allies. We were looking for good people, people who would be horrified by what their government had done, people who would help us find a path that didn't end in genocide. Chen smiled. You were on a very short list, Commander. Velith didn't know what to say. She had been doing her job, following evidence, trying to understand a mystery. She had never thought of herself as exceptional. I have a proposal for you, Chen continued. We're establishing a permanent diplomatic presence in Imperial space. Not just observers, but a real mission. We need people who understand both sides, people who can help build bridges instead of walls. I would like you to be part of that mission. You want me to work for humanity? I want you to work for peace. There's a difference. Chen's expression grew serious. The next 50 years will determine whether our species remain enemies or become something better. That work is too important to be done only by diplomats reading from scripts. It needs people who truly understand what's at stake, people who have seen the worst of both sides and still believe we can do better. Velith thought about her career, her oath, her duty to the Empire. Then she thought about the 80,000 dead on New Harmony, the evidence she had uncovered, the cover-up that had kept it hidden for 40 years. She thought about the Empire she had served and the Empire it could become. I have conditions, she said finally. Chen raised an eyebrow. Such as? I work for peace, not for humanity, not for the Empire. If either side does something wrong, I will say so. I will not be a propaganda tool for anyone. We would expect nothing less. Velith extended her hand in the human gesture she had learned. Then I accept. Chen took her hand and shook it. Welcome to the future, Commander. It's going to be interesting. Behind them, through the observation window, human and Valorian engineers were arguing about the proper way to align a thrust manifold. The argument was friendly, the kind of disagreement that colleagues had every day. Neither side was reaching for weapons. Neither side was threatening the other. It was a small thing, but small things added up. That was how you built peace. One handshake at a time, one repaired ship at a time, one conversation at a time. The monsters from the human fleet had turned out to be something else entirely. Not conquerors, not avengers, just people who had made a choice about who they wanted to be. And that choice was changing everything. The memorial on New Harmony was completed exactly 50 years after the massacre. It stood in a valley that had once been a farming community, where orchards had grown and children had played. The Dreth had burned everything. For 4 decades, the land had been left as it was, a permanent scar on the planet's surface. Only now, as part of the healing process, had the survivors agreed to build something there. The structure was simple, a wall of black stone, carved with 80,000 names, not organized by family or location or age, just alphabetical, equal in death as they should have been equal in life. Maya Chen, 11 days old. The youngest victim, Robert Chen, 43 years old. Maya's father, Admiral Chen's son, Sarah Chen, 39 years old. Maya's mother, she had worked as a nurse at the colony hospital. Admiral Chen stood before the wall in her dress uniform, medals gleaming in the afternoon sun. She was very old now, past 90, her hair completely white. Rejuvenation treatments could have kept her looking young, but she had refused them years ago. She wanted to look her age. She wanted the weight of time to show on her face. "Hello, my darlings," she whispered to the names carved in stone. "I'm sorry it took so long." Behind her, thousands had gathered for the dedication ceremony. Humans from across their colonies, Valorians who had come to pay respects. Representatives from species throughout the galaxy who wanted to witness this moment. The story of New Harmony had become a legend, a turning point in galactic history. Commander Velith, now Ambassador Velith, stood in the crowd with her human colleagues. 50 years of peace had changed her in ways she still struggled to understand. She had watched the Empire transform from a brutal hierarchy into something more like a genuine civilization. She had helped negotiate treaties, resolve disputes, and build institutions that made accountability possible. Not everything was perfect. There were still tensions, still resentments, still factions on both sides who wanted to return to the old ways. But the direction was clear, and Velith had spent her life helping to maintain it. Grand Admiral Thesic had died 10 years ago, mourned by both humans and Valorians. He had spent his final decades working to reform the imperial military, to instill values of restraint and honor that had been forgotten during the Empire's long dominance. His funeral had been attended by human admirals who had once been his enemies and had become his friends. His son, who now led the Imperial fleet, had sworn to continue that work. The sins of the grandfather would not be repeated by the grandson. Admiral Chen approached the podium. She moved slowly, her joints stiff with age, but her voice was still strong. The crowd fell silent. 50 years, she began. That's how long it has been since we lost the people whose names are carved on this wall. 50 years since the worst day in human history. 50 years since we faced a choice that would define who we were as a species. She looked out at the assembled crowd. Humans, Valorians, Dreth, yes, even Dreth. The species that had committed the massacre had undergone its own transformation in the decades since. New generations had grown up learning what their ancestors had done, learning to feel shame for it, learning that strength did not require cruelty. We could have chosen revenge, Chen continued. We had the power. We built ships that could have burned the galaxy. We could have repaid slaughter with slaughter, made the stars run red with the blood of our enemies. Many wanted us to. Many still believe we should have. She shook her head slowly. But we remembered something important. We remembered that the people who killed our families were not monsters from another universe. They were beings with families of their own, with hopes and fears and dreams. They had been raised in a culture that taught them the weak existed only to serve the strong. They had never been given a chance to learn differently. So we gave them that chance. We showed them what strength could mean when it was paired with mercy. We proved that power did not require tyranny. We offered an alternative to the endless cycle of violence that had defined galactic civilization for millions of years. She gestured at the crowd, at the humans and aliens standing side by side. Look at what we have built together. 50 years of peace between species that were once enemies. Trade routes that bring prosperity to worlds that knew only poverty. Schools where children learn about each other's cultures, each other's histories, each other's dreams. A galactic community that solves problems through dialogue instead of warfare. Her voice grew soft. None of this was easy. None of it was guaranteed. There were moments when everything almost fell apart. Moments when the old hatreds threatened to consume us. We made it through because enough people on all sides chose to be better than their ancestors. Chose to reach for something higher than vengeance. She turned to look at the memorial wall. I wish my grandchildren could see what their deaths helped create. I wish I could tell them that their sacrifice was worth it. I cannot know if they would agree. I cannot know if we made the right choice. Tears ran down her weathered face. But I can tell you what I believe. I believe that somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, they are proud of us. Proud that we did not become the monsters who killed them. Proud that we found another way. Proud that their memory lives on, not in destruction, but in the peace we built together. She stepped back from the podium. The crowd remained silent for a long moment. Then softly someone began to clap. Others joined in. The applause grew until it filled the valley, echoing off the memorial wall. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, Ambassador Velith found herself standing alone before the wall of names. She had met Admiral Chen many times over the years, but they had never discussed the personal loss behind the Admiral's famous restraint. Now she understood it better. A young Valorian child approached her, holding her father's hand. The child was perhaps 7 years old with bright blue scales and curious eyes. "Excuse me," the child said. "My father said I should ask you a question." Velith knelt to be at the child's eye level. "Of course. What would you like to know?" "Why didn't the humans destroy us when they had the chance?" Velith looked at the memorial wall, then back at the child. It was a question she had been asked many times over the decades. She had given many different answers, but today, standing in this place, she found the simplest one. Because they decided that who they chose to be mattered more than what had been done to them. The child frowned, trying to understand. But we were their enemies. We hurt them. Yes, and they hurt us back in a way. They defeated us completely, but then they helped us become better. They showed us that being strong doesn't mean being cruel. Velith smiled. That's the lesson they taught the galaxy. That's what we're all still learning. The child's father nodded gratefully and led his daughter away. Velith watched them go, thinking about all the children who would grow up in a galaxy shaped by choices made 50 years ago. The Prometheus and its sister ships still existed. They patrolled the void between stars, silent guardians that everyone knew about but few ever saw. Humanity had not disarmed. They had learned too well that peace required the capability for war, even if that capability was never used. But the ships were not symbols of threat anymore. They were symbols of protection. Every species in the galaxy knew that humanity would respond if innocents were threatened. Not with genocide, not with revenge, with measured, precise justice that held the guilty accountable while sparing the innocent. It was a promise that had been tested many times over 50 years. Twice, human fleets had intervened to stop massacres. Once, they had ended a war that threatened to engulf an entire sector. Each time, they had used the minimum force necessary, had worked to rebuild rather than destroy, had offered former enemies a path back to peace. Not everyone loved humanity for this. Some resented their power. Some questioned their right to act as galactic police. Some whispered that they were no better than the old empire, just more subtle about their dominance. But most understood. Most remembered what the galaxy had been like before the Prometheus appeared at Throne Prime. Most preferred the current peace, imperfect as it was, to the endless wars of the past. Admiral Chen died 3 years after the memorial dedication. She passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family, having lived long enough to see the 50th anniversary of the day she had offered the Empire a choice. Her funeral was broadcast across the galaxy. Leaders of 100 species sent condolences. Ships of many nations performed ceremonial flights in her honor. The Prometheus itself made a rare appearance, emerging from wherever it usually hid to hold position above Earth during the ceremony. Its massive hull blocked out the stars, a reminder of the power that had always been there, waiting, choosing restraint. On its bridge, a new admiral stood watch. Admiral Chen's great niece named Maya after the infant who had died on New Harmony. She was young for the command, barely 50, but she had been trained for this role since childhood. She understood what the fleet represented. She understood the weight of the choices it had been built to make. "Admiral," her communications officer reported, "the ceremony is complete. We've been requested to stand down and return to patrol." Maya Chen looked at the blue-green world below, the homeworld of humanity, the species that had risen from a violent past to become something better. "Send acknowledgement," she said. "Resume standard operations." The Prometheus turned and began its slow journey back into the darkness between stars. Where it was going, no one knew. When it would be needed again, no one could say. But it would be there, always watching, always waiting, always ready to demonstrate what true strength really meant. In a universe of predators and prey, humanity had become something new. Not the biggest predator, not the most ruthless killer. Something harder to define, but more important. They had become the conscience of the galaxy. And for those who were paying attention, that was more terrifying than any warship could ever be.